at the front of the, out the back. So all the lights you can see in my background are all the fairy lights at Avid Reader as we gather, huddle together, early crisp spring night, drinking our glasses of wine, no social distancing whatsoever, because pandemic, what pandemic? In this alternative world, there is not a pandemic. Anyway, it's lovely to see you all, and I'm going to just let some final people in, and we're going to begin the introductions. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking from. In this area, it's the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and I would like to pay my deepest respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge that because of this Zoom universe, we are zooming out to the lands of many other traditional owners, and I'd like to pay my respects to all the elders of the language groups of the land on which you are meeting us, and to say that sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and particularly today because it's Indigenous Literacy Day, and so hopefully you guys will jump onto Avid Reader after this recording and purchase not only the book of the moment, Steven Conte's book, but also perhaps a book by an Indigenous Aboriginal writer. And to help you do that, I'm going to show you where the chat function is by putting a link to the book of the moment, the Tolstoy Estate, and that is the link there. And for tonight and for the next 24 hours, it will be 10% off if you use the code EVENT, EVENT, at the online checkout. So do take use of that and go shopping when we finish our chat tonight. I'm sure you'll want to race out and grab this book. But of course, if you are in Melbourne, I do encourage you to shop from your local Melbourne or Victorian bookstore, because we understand that particularly in Melbourne, they're doing it tough. So we do want you to support your Melbourne bookstores as well. So on that note, I'll just give you a couple of things about the Zoom. You're all on silent, as you might have noticed. And at the end of the event, I'm going to call for questions, but the questions can come into that chat function there. So anytime you think of a question, you don't have to wait till the end. You can just put your questions in that chat function. That'll come directly to me, and I'll be able to ask Steven the questions at the end of the event. And also right at the end of the event, I'm going to open the room up for a clap. So that means that I will allow you all to unmute yourselves towards the very end of the event, and then we will be able to have a clap, just like we're in real life. It's very exciting. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to the wonderful Cass Moriarty, who I am now going to always describe as a dead set legend, because she is. Her novel, The Promised Seed, was longlisted for the 2017 International Dublin Literary Award and shortlisted for the 2016 People's Choice category in the QLAs in 2013. And she has a Bachelor of Business Communication degree from the Queensland University of Technology, and has worked in public relations, advertising and marketing, and has 6 billion children. So everybody please welcome Cass Moriarty.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. Yeah, 6 million. It sometimes feels like 6 million. Look, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Avid Reader online Zoom event, bringing together readers, writers, and the literary community. In these COVID times, social media is keeping authors, publishers, and booksellers thriving, as Chrissy said. So if you enjoy tonight's event, please spread the word through social media, buy a book, follow our authors, and help support the writing community. Whatever you can do is a huge help. Now, in 2008, Steven Conte was awarded the inaugural Prime Minister's Literary Fiction Award for his book, The Zookeeper's War. It was also shortlisted for the 2008 Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book, and for the 2007 Christine Estate Award for Fiction. The novel was published in Australasia, the UK and Ireland, and translated into Spanish and Portuguese. Tonight, with no pressure at all, Steven, after that fantastic debut achievement, we're here to discuss your eagerly awaited second novel, The Tolstoy Estate, a brilliantly observed and beautifully written tale of love, heartbreak, madness, trauma and hope in the midst of World War II, inspired by the life and work of Leo Tolstoy. Welcome, Steven.
Thank you, Cass. Thank you, Chrissy.
Now, it's been 13 years since the publication of The Zookeeper's War. What have you been doing with yourself?
That's a terrific question.
And is the Tolstoy Estate a 13-year labour of love, or is it more recent?
Yes, more recent. The Tolstoy Estate is a labour of love of 5 years. And in between it and The Zookeeper's War, there was a novel set in Australia, which sadly failed to find a publisher. So, I think it had some merit, but whether or not my strong suit just happens to be historical fiction, I haven't quite given up the ambition of writing about our milieu, but for now that project is put aside, and in between, as people say, life happened as well, and there were difficulties. I like to say there were 3 reasons, or I'm embarrassed to admit there were 3 reasons: a failed novel, a failed marriage, sadly, which although it's now all friendly now, and also the anxiety and depression that flowed from that. So, if you just keeping it real, all the obstacles that writers have to overcome to actually get a work out there. Sometimes life intervenes.
Look, that's so refreshing to hear you say that, and I'm sure that a lot of the writers who are watching tonight, that will just resonate so strongly, because life does get in the way. And the fact that you have had such a success with your first novel, and then this second one that I've read is so brilliant, and then to hear you say that you had a failed one in between, I think that just gives us all hope. So thank you for sharing that with us. Now, full disclosure, I have not read War and Peace, but that didn't diminish my enjoyment of this new novel at all, despite the fact that the whole story is centred around the character of Tolstoy and his contemporaries. It's set on Tolstoy's actual estate, and the themes of your book often coalesce with the themes in War and Peace. So tell us, why Tolstoy, and what influence has he had on your writing life, and why was he the muse for this story?
Well, like a lot of inspirations that writers have, it goes back a long, long way. So I was an inmate in a boys' boarding school as a child, an adolescent. And so my salvation, my escape was to read. And I had, at the age of 14, I encountered Lord of the Rings, like many 14-year-olds, and devoured that. And so I literally put down Lord of the Rings and thought, what's another very, very long book I can immerse myself in? And so it was by far my most precocious reading act. I picked up War and Peace and enjoyed it. I've reread War and Peace obviously to produce this novel. And looking back, I really feel that I didn't miss a lot. I'd actually remembered a lot of the plot, a lot of the characters, and I don't think it was too much over my head. There's something eternal about it that can certainly appeal to a 14-year-old.
That is very impressive. At War and Peace at 14, that's very impressive.
Well, yeah, it was definitely the most precocious bit of reading I ever did. Yes, that's for sure.
So getting onto your book, and without giving away any spoilers, tell us a little bit about this story, about the German doctor Paul Bauer and the fiery Russian Katerina Trubetzkaya.
Trubetzkaya.
Thank you. And the circumstances through which they meet. Just give us a taste.
So the novel opens with Paul in a convoy driving through the driving rain and the notorious mud of the Russian rainy autumn season, the Rasputitsia. and the slow progress that they make towards their goal, which is they discover they've been put up for the night, and it turns out for longer in this, initially they just think it's an old aristocratic manorial estate. And when they arrive, they find, Bauer finds to his amazement and stupefaction that it's the estate of Leo Tolstoy, and that he, Bauer, had read War and Peace as a 14-year-old and developed an enthusiasm for Tolstoy and Russian literature. So he's immediately blown away. And then he and his comrades, who are setting up a field hospital there at this only surviving building in the entire area, are confronted by the local custodian, the acting chief custodian, Katerina Trubetzkaya, who proceeds to give them hell.
She does. She certainly does. So this book, it is a war story, but it's also a tale of great literature, and it's a warning of nationalistic madness. But above all, it's a love story. Paul and Katerina only know each other for 6 short but intense weeks during that freezing winter in 1941. But you very cleverly structure the story so that about halfway through, the linear narrative is interrupted by letters from some years into the future. You tease us with a glimpse of the characters' future selves, and then you return us straight back into the action, leaving us wondering how on earth you're eventually going to get us from the story to that future time. And you do this several times in the book to really great effect, I think. When did you decide to use that as a literary device? And did you realise that it would be so effective in slowing down the narrative whilst also making the reader sort of desperate to get to the finish?
Yeah, so it was a realisation during the writing. It came with, it seems ungracious to talk about another book that caused me some dissatisfaction, but I had a lingering aesthetic dissatisfaction from reading Captain Corelli's Mandolin, which is a wonderful book in many ways, another, in a sense, grand romance with a World War II as a backdrop. And then it had this long postscript, this sort of 60 or 70 pages about then what happened to them after the war. And I felt that it sort of clung on there at the end in a slightly clumsy way, in a anticlimactic way. And so that immediately prompted me, well, there's a natural satisfaction. Where are they now? We want to know, where are they now? What if I move that inside the narrative, the main narrative of those 6 weeks? Because you lose, of course, every decision-making structure you gain and you lose. And I was losing the suspense that, okay, it's clear then my main characters are going to survive the war. But Ian McEwan actually alerted me to the fact, he made this very wise comment, a master of suspense, that suspense isn't about mystery. It's not about really withholding information at all. It's actually about leaking a certain amount of information so that the reader has something to latch onto and feel nervous about, to be curious about. And so I thought readers like to be surprised, as long as it seems plausible. They like to be frustrated, in the ongoing actions, something being withheld, and they think, oh, I want to hear, leave them wanting more. And then I thought I was creating another narrative in which to build suspense, that, okay, what is happening in this other time frame as well? And I enjoyed, for example, Katerina in this exchange says, and your colleagues who died, what were their names again? Once again, seeding that suspense that in the reader.
Yeah, it works extremely well, and it really does nothing to diminish the suspense. I think maybe because it's not about the what happens, it's about the why it happens. So even though you've as you say, you've seeded what happens to the main characters and whether they actually survive or not, you don't know why or how they get to be in that place, and that's what you're desperate to find out. So yeah, that was really, really clever and very well done, I thought.
Yeah, the one of the lovely editors who worked on the book had this metaphor that that explained to me what I was doing. Talked about a concertina effect, the sort of the compression of the main story and then the sudden expansion out, because I wanted to give, and this is something that largely, not entirely, but somewhat missing from my first novel, that big, broad expanse. I wanted to, obviously I couldn't write anything as long as War and Peace, but I wanted the reader to have at least an intimation of that spanning a life that spans decades and these grand historical sweeps of time.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that what emphasises that even more is that the main narrative is 6 weeks long, so it's really a very short period. But then you take us into, as you say, decades into the future.
Yes, so it's something that I very much enjoyed, having that expansiveness. I mean, anyone who has read my novel, The Zookeeper's War, will know it's all about claustrophobia. It's about being, inside a zoo in wartime Berlin, inside a cellar during the bombing. It's all about containment, probably sort of inbuilt trauma from my days in a boys' boarding school, to be honest. And so, here I love that. I love that sense of entrapment and invoking that, and have done that in the estate, where the Germans are sort of stuck for fear of leaving and being attacked by partisans. So it was a bit of a holiday for me to break out and spread myself over decades.
So the Tolstoy Estate, I think, is one of those rare books that encompasses many aspects. So the writing uses poetic and literary language, but it also includes a fast-paced and a tense plot. The touchstone of Tolstoy is a reference to great literature, but the story is told in colloquial dialogue that's very relatable and easy to read. And I wanted to ask you about the dialogue, which I thought was just absolutely spot on. It's authentic. I mean, a few lines of dialogue tell us more about the characters than a whole page of description could. And it's so funny. This book is very, very funny. Did the voices of the characters come easily to you, or did you spend a long time developing their personalities?
Some of there are archetypal components to a couple of the characters that made them relatively easy, to be honest. It's a thrill and a joy to write a strong woman, always is. And in a way, you want in a book characters who will say anything, and that's such a joy. And so Paul Bauer, my hero, is a more reticent man compared to some of the people around him. Certainly Katerina is more fiery, and she is disinhibited with rage, which is a terrific thing to have in a character. And then, my disreputable anaesthetist, Herman Molyneux, is one of those terrific people, stop at nothing. He's a vulgarian, he's a bon vivant. And so he was a joy because he could say anything vulgar and funny, these characters gave me permission and did make themselves known as I was writing. They just clamored for attention on the page. And so in a way that was easy. It's harder to write a quieter person, a character who has something to hide, as my dentist Volker Hirsch has, for example. And you work at a character like that, they're less dramatic, and their dialogue is less evocative of who they are necessarily.
So many great characters in this book. How do you think that you achieved such an easy rapport between the reader and the characters, despite the fact that they're not only in a completely different time and place, but they're conversing in a different language? Presumably this is all actually occurring in Russian and German.
Yes, primarily.
And yet sorry.
Yes, well, when you write that, you are constrained. I'm a slow writer, and this is one of the things that actually did slow me down, although I do now enjoy writing dialogue a lot. It was, when I started out my career as a writer, I think I was a bit stilted, but I really worked at it, and it's one of those things that didn't come naturally. You know, I don't have film scripts in my bottom drawer. I had to really work at a dialogue that worked for me. And you are constrained by not allowing anachronisms to creep in, you know, the wrong sort of metaphor. I mean, of course, the conceit is this is all in German, but you can't let expressions in from English that would not have existed in 1940s English. That's the conceit that you're working in. There's a certain amount of labour behind it and craft, but yeah, once again, just inhabiting the characters well enough and letting them let it rip is a way of making that happen.
Well, I think, you know, like all good writers, you hide all that labour and craft very well, and it looks like it's done seamlessly. So, yeah, congratulations on that. Now, when I received the copy of the book from your publishers, they described it as a novel for people who still believe in the saving grace of literature in dark times. And I wondered what that means for you, and how does the novel, with its dark themes, obviously of World War II, resonate with contemporary readers now in the midst of the pandemic?
Yeah, so what happens during the course of the novel is that Paul Bauer is actually reading a German copy of War and Peace. He's rereading it as I reread it. So Katerina virtually hurls this copy. In the Tolstoy's library, there is a German section, and she says, "Here, read this. Find out what's going to happen to you. You're going to be sent packing like Napoleon was sent packing." And so Bauer sets about systematically rereading it and himself noticing the parallels. I mean, a lot of my writing is about grabbing the reader by the lapels and saying, it can be this bad. You know, not everybody lives in what until 2020 was our comfortable modern Australian setting. And so the pandemic is in a sense a grand historical event. How grand remains to be seen. We'll see in 10, 20 years how it looks in retrospect. But it's almost the first event in any of our generation's lives that's really intruded on our personal day-to-day life. And really that's a key message of what I think I want to say and what literature has to say. It's to really shake people out of their complacency. As a quote from Kafka that the literature is the axe to break the ice in our soul. I'm roughly paraphrasing, but yeah, there is that sense in which I want to really break open the reader for their heart as well as their awareness.
So along with that, I think some of the other themes in the novel that you explore are duty, loyalty, sacrifice, friendship, and desire. What were you attempting to explore yourself while you were navigating those sort of themes?
I'll build up to that by referring back to the last question a little as well. Something I'd meant to add was, you know, it's a meditation. The novel is a meditation on the place of literature. I mean, later on, Katerina and Paul talk about film and the way that, you know, would Tolstoy in the year 1970 have set out to be a novelist, or would he have become a filmmaker? What I was working through are all my usual preoccupations. All of those issues that you mentioned, questions of friendship, loyalty, certainly desire. And I've always had a thing in my writing about love triangles, and I was mentioning this to a friend. They said, "Oh, there's no obvious love triangle in this book," and I thought that's true. By my standards, it's very muted, because one of the little subplots in it is that Paul finds himself feeling embarrassed to think this, but that he's competing against Katerina's now dead husband, even though Katerina, before his murder by the Stalinist regime, had divorced him. You know, he lives on in her memory as this swashbuckling, heroic type. And I realised that's an archetype in my imagination, being a slightly bookish, quiet, reflective person that some heroic swashbuckling male is going to snatch the desirable desirable love interest away from me at the last moment.
Even if they're a ghost.
Yes, exactly. Even if they're a ghost, and ghosts really happen in this book, don't they? They really exert an influence.
Yeah, they do. They do. Actually, they do. Yeah. The absence of people doesn't mean they're any less present.
Yeah, so I like to say this is not just a love story and a war story, but it is a ghost story. And proudest, the thing I'm in a way most proud of is it's a hospital drama as well. I really enjoyed piling those genres one on top of the other. And really,
well, that was my very next question. I wanted to talk about the hospital scenes because the medical passages in this book are visceral and horrific, and they really highlight the brutality of war. I wondered if you could tell us about a typical field hospital that was set up in a private home occupied by invading forces during the war. So the one, Tolstoy's estate is called, is it Yasnaya Polyana?
Correct, yeah.
Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Perfect.
So yeah, give us a sense of what it was like to set up a field hospital in somebody's estate like that.
So the thing to say about it is that when they arrive, Bauer and his comrades are amazed by this remarkable facility because they've been operating with much worse, because there's probably most people who know anything about either the Russian campaign or, for that matter, the invasion of 1812. The Russian tactic was to burn and retreat. And the only reason these buildings are still standing is because it's a national shrine to the memory of this famous Russian writer of the Russian resistance. And so they're better off than they've been. In one of there's more than one building. There's 3 major buildings on the estate, and one of them is almost ready built to be a hospital. So it's a big operation though, even though they're still moving in an entire hospital, and that means that there are laundries and there are kitchens. You know, someone's got to wash the sheets, and somebody's got to cook the food, and somebody's got to change the bed. So their capacity is about 250, and there's an X-ray machine, and there's an incinerator for medical waste, and clean water and electricity, a generator. So you know, it's an enormous task, but one aided by the fact that finally, instead of working in hovels and burnt out husks, they actually have a nice manorial estate to work on.
And the research that you obviously did a lot of research. You know, that's clear in the book. It's not overdone though. It's just sort of woven into the story, which is perfect. But what did you learn about some of the medical practices of the time that surprised you when you were doing your research?
So, a few of the shocking things, it's surprisingly difficult to work out what medical knowledge was in a given era. And even within the course of the Second World War, like everything else in the Second World War, the technology raced ahead. And in medicine, most dramatically with the arrival of penicillin, for the Allies at least, at the end of the war. But the Germans never got hold of penicillin. And so one of the things that surprised me was, how far military medicine had come. The survival rate was much, much, much better than the First World War, which in turn was much, much better than the US Civil War or the Napoleonic Wars. There were these vast, and the big difference, this is getting a little bit nerdy perhaps, was that in the Second World War, I think it was the first war, the first war in history where fewer people have died of illness than actual wounding and death by ordnance. So, but even so, in some fields, that if a soldier had a stomach wound, any abdominal injury, at one point Bauer comments, the 40% survival rate that he and his commanding officer, Julius Metz, manages considered good. That only once you open up someone's stomach, and the risk of infection is so great without penicillin. So that was a striking thing to realise. And then, to realise that there were improving methods of amputation, that there's this brutal old-fashioned method of sawing through, and then there's the method that Bauer adopts, which takes much longer. He has to arrange the skin in a certain way and dig out nerves and and so on, to make sure that the patient has a better outcome.
So you made quite a few gruesome discoveries, I'm imagining, during your research.
That's right. I'd never heard about gas gangrene. I just heard about gangrene. That gas gangrene is this galloping condition where yes, one stage Bauer puts his ear down to a soldier's stomach and can hear the gas crepitating inside the belly. I mean, these are things that I discovered in my research, reading mostly British war surgeons of the Second World War and their accounts of their surgery.
So why was it important for you to balance those very visceral sections with the really tender and moving passages in between?
Because it's love, death, and the whole damn thing. That's what I admire about Tolstoy, and that's what I'm aspiring to achieve myself. So it's very important for me as a writer to convey what it is like to be embodied in the world. One of the reasons I have a hero who's a surgeon is that I'm the stepson of a doctor and the son of a nurse, and so medicine was always very much in my mind as a child, and has had a big part to play in my imagination. And so I sort of grasped onto this topic once I discovered its existence, and thought, I'm the person to write this, because I'm obsessed with history. I'm fascinated by medicine, and well, the novel, okay, information is great, but the key thing, isn't it? The key thing about a novel, why we read fiction instead of non-fiction, is to be impassioned. I mean, we can learn about surgery, we can learn about warfare in non-fiction. So all of that is great if you can encounter it in a novel, but the tenderness, as you describe it, that's the cornerstone of good fiction.
So true, so true. Tell us a bit about the character of Julius Metz, kind of the opposite of tenderness, and a bit about what you found out about the experimentation of amphetamines during the war. Because Metz is a character who gradually unravels and becomes more and more unhinged as the novel progresses. And I wondered if that was a metaphor for the German war machine more generally.
Yes, I mean, the Germans, they've got a funny reputation. There's a stereotype of the Germans of the Second World War, and a more general cultural stereotype of them being exacting and very orderly. And so one of the discoveries I made was what a mess it was. That in many ways, right from the top, and we know about the disorganization in that person's head, it was superstitious and strange. So there's a real strand of superstition in the Nazi bureaucracy. Raiders of the Lost Ark is not far off the mark in some of the crazy pagan beliefs that some of those people held. And so I wanted to reflect in Metz that deep superstitious strangeness. I mean, they kicked out a lot of their fine Jewish scientists because they were Jewish. It was a sort of anti-reason, anti-rationalist course that they were pursuing. And so I wanted Metz to be an embodiment and a demonstration of that, of the fish rotting from the head, as it were. And at the same time, I didn't want him to be an out-and-out villain or an out-and-out stereotype. It's very hard when you evoke any German officer, you're immediately in a red alert stereotype danger zone. And so it was important to me that I at least made him explicable as a human being as well.
Yeah, I think you do that so well, because we see the experience of war from the perspective of these German soldiers. So we see their unspoken reservations, their bravado, and probably most importantly, their quietly held fears. And in fact, we become quite sympathetic to them, and also, of course, to the Russian occupied civilians. Do you think that that's the point of great literature, is to create empathy in unexpected places?
I would say yes. In talking about cornerstones, I mean, when I think of the word empathy, I immediately think of George Eliot, you know, as the high priestess of empathy. You know, she certainly thought that that was the key undertaking of literature, and I'm not going to contradict George Eliot. Absolutely. I mean, the Second World War is for anyone from the Allied side, it's our Homeric age. It seems to be a time of moral simplicity and clarity. And, you know, of course, on our side, that wasn't entirely true. And certainly it's obviously not true of anyone who fought on the Axis side. But I've definitely wanted the challenge. I like, you know, this is the second time I've said a book from the German side, and it fascinates me to get into that ambiguity. Okay, what is it like to be on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of a war? And, you know, unfortunately, you know, I don't imagine it's probably terribly controversial here. Australians have had that experience probably ever since the Second World War. We've been on the wrong side. Well, let's say since 1953, shall we? That complexity and ambiguity is fertile territory.
And I think that's where your use of humour really comes to the fore as well, because I think that's what makes these characters so relatable, is that they're just like our own, you know, brothers, fathers, friends. The way that they speak to each other. I think that's what helps.
Yeah. They definitely wanted them to be humanized, but at the same time, I didn't want to whitewash them. This is not some sort of fairy tale version of what the Wehrmacht was. So even in the characters who in many respects are likable or relatable, I wanted to demonstrate from time to time the casual anti-Semitism, for example. You know, just the way it's just part of the mental wallpaper of many of the characters, and how, yes, you can, if it is part of the mental wallpaper of your culture, you don't need to be a bad person to actually imbibe it. You actually need to be a special person, and perhaps a very particularly well-educated person, to resist the propaganda environment in which you move.
Yeah, they're certainly very complex characters, but, you know, as most humans are. I think in the book that you managed to highlight, and this is probably following on from what we're talking about, you highlight both the very best and the very worst of human behaviour through the smallest acts, or the simplest phrases, or the most subtle and nuanced interactions, which really has the effect of emphasising the commonalities of human experience rather than our differences. So are you saying that that was something you were thinking consciously of while you were writing, or did that just sort of happen organically?
I think it's my temperament as a writer to go for extreme experiences. I mean, it's a lovely complimentary thing you're saying, because, you know, in being a writer who goes for dramatic stories, who puts explosions in their books, in a way, then the absolute highest compliment that I could hear is that, okay, you're actually evoking people with subtlety and as well at the same time, and that's certainly what I'm trying to do, as I say, to give it the whole spectrum, from these most extreme experiences, which really fascinate me, that what people are like in extremis, right through to those delicate, almost Jane Austenish like interactions. So that's definitely that's. I mean, I suppose I'd like to think that as I get older, that's I'm getting a little wiser, and that some of that subtlety is spreading through my writing as well.
Bit of life experience. Someone somewhere I read that was talking about the psychological, the emotional, the physical, and the moral limits that the characters reach and how they react. Is there any one example that you'd like to give us of one of the characters that just reaches a limit in one of those areas and reacts in a way that perhaps you hadn't predicted? Without giving away any, you know, spoilers, obviously.
Yeah, sure. Let me. I suppose Graham Greene is an author who I originally noticed how he described how, as he laboured away at a character, a difficult character that often refused to come into focus properly, and had to labour away at it, that often that's a character that ultimately stood out as a usually secondary character. And you know, my Volker Hirsch, my dentist, you know, who's a mystery to the others and to himself. You know, this is the character that I enjoyed in that sadistic, authorial way of putting him under increasing stress until you know, the various cracks and fractures and secrets in his life are eventually pull him apart. So yeah, he'd be an example, but he's certainly not the only example. You know, we're talking secondary and tertiary characters. That Bauer goes at one stage for a stint right on the front line. So Yasnaya Polyana is 15 kilometers behind the front lines in front of the city of Tula, which the Germans are trying to capture. From that 15 kilometers, they can hear the guns in the background on a daily basis. When Bauer goes there, he's replacing a young lieutenant, Erich Pilz, who is, when Bauer last saw him, was a functioning fine surgeon, but he discovers him going to bits, absolutely completely losing it, and just walking out of operations in the middle of them, and terrified, strange enough, of going back to the relative comfort of Yasnaya Polyana, because he's terrified of Metz, their commanding officer.
Mm. Yeah, one of my other questions was going to be, what are some of your favourite minor characters? But I think you've just answered that, and I think the way that you've answered it explains why you enjoy them so much, because you've paid attention and you've given those minor characters the same respect as you have the major characters, and I think that really shows in the novel.
Thanks, Cass.
I wanted to quickly talk about the beginning. So the very opening of the novel, you take us immediately into the action from the very first page. We're straight into this very intense scene with really no explanation of who, what, where. We're just sort of immersed into this scene and expected to keep up. What is it about that sort of writing that makes it so exhilarating to read? And what is it that you're asking of the reader when you put them in that situation?
Yeah, it is a big demand on the reader. And as I realised yesterday I was having a conversation with the actor who is performing the audiobook. And I apologised to him. I said, look, you know, sorry for this opening scene, because you don't get any opportunity. Really, it's Bauer is asleep he is pretending to be asleep in a pitching lorry as it's driven through the mud, and he's listening to the conversation of his two subordinates, Winkel and Flieger, and their conversation about, well, is this wise to be driving through this dark forest when there's so many partisans about? And, you know, their exchange before their characters are developed, really, it's like something from Waiting for Godot. It could be any two people talking. So once again, you're trading off. I'm in a sense throwing the reader in at the deep end. But look, it's also a frankly cinematic technique, isn't it? There's nothing like throwing a viewer in a film and a reader in a novel straight into the action to once again, grab them by the lapels and make them feel as though they're there. I mean, it's really, once again, this feeling of being embodied. I want the reader to feel the pain on the side of Bauer's head as he's tossed and hits his head on the frame of the lorry's window, or when he gets out of the lorry 10 minutes later, the squelch and suck and weight of the mud on his boots. So yeah, I just love pitching the reader in that way.
Yeah, I can highly recommend the novel generally, but that opening scene, which finishes quite shockingly with a shocking event at the end of that opening scene. That opening scene really is just a great example of how to just delve straight into the characters and their situation without feeling like you have to explain anything or, you know, set the scene, or it's just you're right in there, you're in that truck with those characters right from the beginning.
Yeah, and also because I dare say there's often writers and aspiring writers, you know, who are watching. I mean, I will frankly give credit to, in one respect, to Ian McEwan, because one of the things I admire about a lot of the start of McEwan's books is he just, you know, once again, I think mystery is overrated. And at the start of some of his novels, he just says who the character is. And so, you know, I have this line of dialogue where these two subordinates are talking, and then I just say, Paul Bauer, age 40, a military surgeon, you know, and ... and he's doing that. So I just lay it out. This is his name, this is his age, this is his profession. Let's get on with things. Get on with things.
Yeah, well done. This novel made me feel, Steven, very, very cold all the way through. What were some of the techniques in the writing or the language that you were consciously using to depict those freezing temperatures of that time? And how cold are we talking? How cold did it get in a Russian occupied estate in World War II?
So it gets down in reality and in the course of the novel to minus 43 degrees centigrade. And most of the novel happens between, well, once they arrive, they're there for a few days in late autumn, and then the winter arrives. And so the rest of the novel, the highest temperature is -3. So
that's why I felt so cold.
Yes, that's the balmy day. He comments, oh, it's quite pleasant walking out in -3. So that's, you know, I think it's good to get a draft down without relying too much on the thesaurus, but you really want to strain the limits of synonyms in English, because you don't want to be saying, oh, the characters are freezing the whole time. The characters were freezing. So, you know, it's an opportunity to really have some vivid, wonderful metaphors and so on. And also, once again, these physical evocations. Once again, quite late in the piece, you know, one of my editors had happened to live in Montreal, and she said, oh, and you know, the hairs in your nostrils start to freeze and get brittle, and you're welcome to borrow that if you like. So I snatched that. So all of those little observations, and yes, the eyelashes icing up and things of that nature.
Is it the Germans that have 40 different words for snow or something? Or is that
I think that might be the Inuit, but
Inuits, okay.
Yeah, but I dare say
Germans have a lot of words for different things.
They do as well. Yes, that being their experience, and the Russians no doubt.
All right, we're just about to throw to some audience questions if we have some, but while Chrissy's organising that, do we have to wait another 13 years for your next novel, Steven?
No, you know, as I said, I'm determined life won't intervene as much. This, you know, I don't want to make it a sob story, but I left out of my dire account the fact that I have a 7-year-old son with severe non-verbal autism. So a lot of the last 5 years, you know, I've been writing this book. I've also been doing some pretty intense parenting, but you know, there's a certain sort of stability has come about, is settling into all of that now, and yes, I think I'll always be slowish, I'll always be deliberate, but we're not going to be waiting that long.
Excellent.
That's very exciting to hear, isn't it? Thanks, Cass. That was really fantastic questions. And like, I think that it's really piqued people's interests in the book. We have quite a few questions, so I'll just dive right in. One of the questions from Barbara is, are the characters Paul and Catherine inspired by characters in War and Peace? And if so, which ones?
No, I'm going to have to disappoint in this case. None of the characters in War and Peace were direct inspirations. I mean, Katerina and Paul talk a lot about Natasha, Natasha Rostova, who of course is the famous heroine of War and Peace. And Katerina says, oh, you know, I doubt that if we'd met in real life that I would be friendly with her. And then she goes on to say, of course, that's acknowledging in a way Tolstoy's brilliance. So I think Tolstoy, you know, we're talking about 19th century writer. He's a great, capacious writer, but he's got problems with strong women. So immediately, I think Katerina is a 20th century figure. I mean, I think Tolstoy almost feels great compassion for women, almost against his natural inclinations. And later in his career, as he got more religious, he got a little bit punitive towards his women. It was already coming out at the end of Anna Karenina. You know, she had to be punished for being a sexual woman. So I think one of the things I'm trying to do is evoke just how modern, in many ways, people in mid-20th century were to our outlook. And Katerina is definitely a modern woman in that regard.
Thank you for that. Tony Jordan has asked a question. Hi, Tony. She wants to know if you thought that you could have written this book 13 years ago, or did you need to be a different writer and a different person in order to tackle the story? So perhaps was that break between books actually the thing that you needed to be able to write a book of this nature and this quality?
Yes, well, Tony, who I met 13 years ago, we'll discover when we meet again that yes, I am a more mature human being. I think just a bit more reflective, quieter, a little bit sobered by experience, and I think that does come out in a more compassionate outlook. I mean, I don't want to badmouth my first novel. I think in many ways it's a compassionate book, but there's probably you know, it's in some respects even more confronting. There's a strain of, once again, I don't want to sort of badmouth my older self, but there's a strain almost of cruelty running through it. I mean, there's this horrible situation of the animals being bombed in the zoo. And I'd like to think that there's a kinder spirit at work in this book.
Mm. Now, Bernadette has asked about the dialogue, which she says she loves good dialogue, and wants to know whether the writing process of dialogue, is there ever a time when you write without using dialogue and then add the dialogue in, or does the dialogue come as you're writing?
Yeah, it's very much the latter. In fact, if anything, it's the opposite. I laboured, as I've already admitted, at this book, and never, you know, I was about 60% of the way through, and I thought, oh, you know, what with everything else going on, I haven't really felt flow. I've been in a flow state, and I thought, well, the good news is I'm 60% through. But what that's to say is that afterwards, I really galloped, by my standards at least. I galloped, and actually there was a lot of dialogue. There was too much dialogue. And for example, I had chapters ending on a line of dialogue and then a new chapter beginning with dialogue. And I wanted to, I definitely wanted to introduce then the buffering of some more narrative. It was too dialogue heavy. So yeah, exactly the opposite.
Great. Kitty has said that she is of Russian descent and believes that the Russian relatives that she has are of a unique cultural personality, and wants to know whether you have personal contact or association with Russian people, and if you have or haven't, would that have informed your work?
A lot of my evocation of Russian people is coming from research and from fiction, and you know, a lot of intense research into what it was to grow up in the 20s as an intellectual woman in the 20s. And so it's secondhand. I have had the benefit, however, of a fantastic Russian-Dutch translator, of all things, would you believe, who I just met by chance in Italy. And with a terrific, like all of those Russian names are terrific, she's Anna Kuznetsova. And so Anna was a terrific advisor about the bits and pieces of Russian in there, and the patronymics and so on. So I've had that expertise to lean on.
Fantastic. And there's a question here from Danuka. What did you learn from your failed project that you took into the Tolstoy Estate in terms of your writing? Was there anything that you learned from that book that made you a better writer?
Well, I think that, you know, it's a truism in a way that we learn from failure. I think that's a question I haven't been asked before. And I think the answer is probably unpleasing. Well, that we just the need to persist. I can't say I really want to dignify the failure with something especially positive. I mean, in a way, speaking of punitive, I was rapped over the knuckles and said, "Don't try that again. Don't try to write in a conventional, contemporary Australian setting." And so, you know, my knuckles are still smarting from that. So, I haven't learned the lesson. You know, I intend to write another Second World War novel, but I'm also thinking about, you know, perhaps writing in parallel another Australian set story. So perhaps I haven't learned my lesson, but accept the need to persist.
Probably a good thing too. I definitely was told not to write anything apart from what I had started writing when I first did, and I ignored all of that advice, and it's been good. So please persist with your Australian-based story. I think that will end up a beautiful thing. So there's a question here from Elke. Have you been to Russia yourself?
No, it's all smoke and mirrors, I'm afraid. Shocking thing not to have gone to Yasnaya Polyana myself. There's the writer Mark Henshaw. I spoke to him years ago about this, and who wrote Out of the Line of Fire, and he was saying in some respects the reader does so much of the evocation of a place that if you give them enough cues, they will build that place for you. Okay, by not having visited a place, you might miss out on 5% of observations, the particular quality of the light or something you might have noticed. But given that the reader does so much of the work, if you're setting a sound and you're imaginative yourself, we've all been cold, just multiply that. I think that you can depend on the reader to do the work. And you know, I've inhabited Russia in 1812. I've inhabited it in the Second World War through Vasily Grossman's life and fate. That's the wonder of fiction. You can be there perhaps more vividly than the people who are there and who have their eyes shut to their ordinary environment.
It's true that when you're a stranger to a place, you see it very differently, that's for sure. I would also just like to ask you about the kind of the impact of the pandemic on some of the writers. I suppose travel is going to be one of the things. There'll be a lot of people who will have to use Dr. Google to discover the place that they might have been about to visit and write about. Do you feel like it's going to have a big impact on the fiction that comes out of this particular period?
Yeah, so I think it's going to, people are going to have to either really, well, there's going to be, for a start, are they going to set it in their novels? You know, if they've got a novel and it's a contemporary novel, are they going to insert the pandemic into the background? How can you possibly insert a pandemic into the background? So I think it's going to give writers a lot of practical problems, including the real world practical ones of getting out there and doing their research in person. And it's going to, I imagine it's going to shift people's outlook as well. Human beings are different once they're plunged into these, well, frankly, life-threatening situations. I think it makes people more morally serious. You know, as Cass was kind enough to notice, there's a lot of humour in this book, and I think laughing in the face of adversity is deeply human. I think we're all going to be a bit sobered up, and maybe that'll be reflected in the style and the tone of writing that comes out.
Well, I do think that we will wait with bated breath for your next book as well, and to see your next books, and to see how you deal with that in your own work. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure to listen to this conversation. I'm going to put the link to your book one more time up on screen and remind people that 10% off if they use the word event at the checkout. Look, it's just been fantastic. Cass and Steven, it's been great to listen to you guys.
Has Steven got a book he can hold up? Because I've got the advanced copy, which is not the actual cover. There we go. There's the proper cover. can I just finish by saying that it is an absolutely inspirational, tender and moving portrait of love and war and all the messy intricacies of the human condition. It's a masterclass in dialogue, setting, characterization, plotting and tension, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. Really, really love this book.
Fantastic. That's a really great recommendation. Cass reads everything. So when she says you definitely have to read this one, she knows in comparison what it is.
Go and get this book.
Go get this book. So thank you, Cass. Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to actually allow people to unmute themselves now so we can have a final clap before I will end the meeting. So thank you very much for doing this. Thank you. So if people
Hey, thanks everybody. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
thanks for watching, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Hi, Tony. Hello.
Nice to see you.